We have about 15 minutes, I think, for questions. So if you would have a question, we'd appreciate that. And we'd also ask if you'd be so kind, we have microphones. If you could just pause, if I know this gentleman right here, and we'll bring a microphone to you so you can ask your question in the microphone. That would be very helpful for our media friends over here. Yes?
Dave Simon with Wells Fargo Advisors. Dr. Plosser, thank you for your comments. I'm curious about your comments on the U.S. dollar. We seem to have concerns, with the weakening of the U.S. dollar and the peg and what's going to happen with some of these currencies becoming stronger. China may be going off the dollar, and just as one of the Fed Bank presidents, I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Floating exchange rates are always a good thing, right? I think that the U.S. government has pursued a floating exchange rate regime with almost all the countries around the world, as most other countries do, and we should preserve that. In terms of the dollar is affected by lots of things, and I think it often behaves differently depending on which the other country is you're comparing it to. I think that, so in that sense, I think the dollar is going to do what it's going to do. But there are things that I think that the Federal Reserve is responsible for primarily that influence the dollar. More than anything, I think ultimately price stability is the important key. Because what we know is that if inflation gains steam and inflation rates rise in the United States relative to some other country, then our currency is going to depreciate relative to that currency. And so one of the ways you keep a strong dollar, which however you want to define that, or one way you keep a stable dollar is to keep inflation rates low. That's certainly the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. It's also true that keeping the economy strong is important for the health of the dollar. But the dollar is not a specific target or a goal of the Federal Reserve per se. And it's not by law or by practice. But we do, as policymakers, look at what's happening to the dollar and try to ask ourselves, okay, what is that telling us about the state of the economy, the state of expectations of inflation, the state of our trading partners, and so forth. And that becomes a useful signal or an input, broadly speaking, to our policy objectives. But we do not have any specific policy objectives with our currencies, nor should we. You notice that at the heart of the crisis, the dollar all of a sudden rose tremendously, after having fallen fairly steadily for, what, a dozen years or so. It spiked up. Why? Well, that reflected a rush to quality and safety, whereas as the international global financial crisis grew, people flocked to dollars. That caused a rise in the value of the dollar. Well, then everybody got set. They didn't complain about it rising, or you didn't hear many headlines about it. But then when it sort of reversed course after the financial crisis eased, the dollar fell back down to sort of where it was before. And then it was all of a sudden made into a crisis, when really it was just the washing out of the flight to quality and flight to safety we saw during the crisis. So the dollar is useful information, but one has to be careful not to read too much into it, particularly taking things serious.
Doctor, in yesterday's news it was reported that China and Japan actually reduced their positions in U.S. Treasuries as of December, at least to some statistics. My question to you is, to what degree can Fed monetary policy in setting interest rates be upset by foreign governments deciding not to buy our debt?
Well, there are a lot of links in that chain. Okay, so first of all, monetary policy. Our goals set by Congress are stable economic growth and price stability. Those are our goals. How foreign governments conduct their monetary policy and fiscal policy has relatively little to do with that, as long as we are on a floating exchange rate regime. The big danger, I think, of course, is that there are two kind of effects you can have. if monetary policy or fiscal policy, if you will, leads to a perception on the part of both domestic and foreign, domestic citizens and foreign governments or foreign central banks, where they fear inflation, then that will drive up nominal interest rates, down real rates, and in fact, those governments may be concerned about holding on to U.S. government securities if they fear that a great inflation is going to occur, and in turn, they will take capital losses on those securities if they chose to sell them. So fear of inflation could be one mechanism that would induce those foreign governments to dump, if you will, their treasuries. It would be one mechanism. In fact, it wasn't Japan that reduced its hold, it was primarily China, and actually now Japan now holds more of our government securities than China does, which hadn't been the case for some time. So I think that the real issue here is not about monetary policy. The real issue here is about fiscal policy. And that with the large fiscal deficits that our country is running right now, what's going to be the appetite of the world to absorb that debt, and at what price? If they're unwilling to absorb it, the price will fall, interest rates will rise, and that will make things a lot more difficult for the fiscal position. If that becomes so excessive, and the Fed becomes politicized to the point where Congress and the politics urge the Fed to finance those deficits by printing money, then that will translate itself into a very big inflation scare, and we'd have a lot more. So, as long as we maintain roughly a flexible exchange rate, as long as the Fed stays focused on ensuring price stability and economic growth, then I think we can deal with that in a pretty straightforward way. But fiscal policy in this country is unsustainable right now, and that's going to put pressure on interest rates eventually, and on how we're going to pay for the spending that we're doing. So, and the willingness of foreign governments to fund those deficits. So it's all kind of interreactive. It depends on which angle you want to take on it.